Commander Allari stood on the precipice of truth, her heart racing with the weight of the secrets buried deep within her very being. A soldier made from genetic manipulation, her life, her every move scripted by someone else. Until now. The data core she had lost could have given her answers, but it was gone, along with the last piece of her past. The silence of space was only broken by the hum of the ship's engines, the only constant in her unpredictable mission. And by Connor Hayes, the human who had somehow become more than just a distraction, who had unwittingly become a part of the puzzle she needed to solve. As they made their way through the galaxy, her mind fought the gnawing question, was she a weapon or something more? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more epic sci-fi adventures. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about Allari and Connor's journey. Don't miss out. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The docking bay of the Velian dreadship Urax was a cavernous expanse of dark metal, its cold blue lights casting long shadows across the floor. The air hummed with the machinery's pulse, thick with the scent of oil and metal, a testament to the ship's relentless power. Commander Allari stood at its center, her armor reflecting the dim light with a polished menace. Ancient Varelian runes carved into her pauldrons shimmered faintly, each line a story of honor and victory. Her long ears, a mark of her kind's refinement, twitched slightly as she scanned the area, her eyes sharp and calculating. She was waiting for the human. The thought still rankled her. A human, assigned to her elite unit? It had to be a mistake, or perhaps a test from the High Command to see how she would handle such an anomaly. Her second-in-command, Juka, stood beside her, his mandibles clicking softly. "Do you think he'll be of any use, Commander?" he asked. Allari kept her gaze fixed on the docking ramp. "We'll see," she replied curtly. "But I doubt it." Memories flashed through her mind, unbidden, unwanted. The Battle of Zirian, where a human pilot had fled, leaving her unit to face overwhelming odds. They had survived, but barely, and the scars of that betrayal ran deep. Humans were unpredictable, unreliable, and now she was expected to work with one. The shuttle landed with a hiss of hydraulics, and the ramp lowered. Out stepped the human, Lieutenant Connor Hayes. He was shorter than she expected, his build broader but lacking the lean, deadly grace of a Velian warrior. His armor looked ill-fitting, almost soft compared to the hard, angular designs of her own. His hair was a wild tangle, defying any sense of order, and he carried his helmet under his arm as if it were an afterthought. As he approached, he raised a hand in a small, awkward wave. Allari's eyes narrowed. Was that a greeting or a sign of nervousness? She decided to take charge of the situation. Stepping forward, she stood tall, her presence commanding. "You are Lieutenant Hayes," she stated, her voice cutting through the air. The human grinned, a smile that seemed out of place in the grim surroundings. "That's me," he said, his tone light and casual. I let the silence stretch, hoping to smother him with it. Instead, he looked around dramatically and whispered, "If this is the part where you tell me I'm doomed, could we maybe skip to the paperwork?" Allari's jaw tightened. This was not how things were done in the Velian military. Discipline, respect, these were the foundations of their order. "You will address me as Commander Allari," she said sharply. "You will follow orders precisely. You will not embarrass this unit." He saluted, but it was more of a casual gesture than a proper military salute. "Understood, Commander Allari. I'll try to embarrass us at a slow, manageable pace." There was a snort from the ranks behind her, probably Zirith. Allari ignored it. But internally, she noted the human's ability to elicit such a reaction. It was unusual. She turned on her heel. "Follow me," she ordered. As they walked through the assembly hall, Allari couldn't help but notice how out of place the human looked among her warriors. The Velians moved with precision and grace, their every step a testament to their training, their twin-bladed spears slicing the air in synchronized forms. Connor, on the other hand, seemed to lumber along, his boots clunking loudly on the metal floor. "You are familiar with Velian martial standards?" she asked without looking back. I've read the manual twice, he replied cheerfully. Some parts were pretty interesting, especially the honor duels. You guys really take grudges seriously. It is not a grudge, she corrected, her tone sharp. It is tradition, right? He said, nodding as if he understood, though she doubted he did. Extremely pointy tradition. A corner of her mouth twitched, but she suppressed it. She would not let this human see her amused. They reached the sparring grounds, a wide open expanse bordered by humming energy pillars that cast a faint glow on the metal floor. Allari halted, and her soldiers stopped their drills, turning to watch. Demonstration, she ordered. Xerath stepped forward, his energy glaive already spinning in his hand. He was one of her best, strong and skilled, with a reputation for being unbeatable in sparring matches. Connor set his helmet down and stretched, as if preparing for a leisurely activity rather than a test of combat. Any rules? He asked. Stay alive, Allari said simply. The match began, and Xerath attacked with his usual ferocity. His glaive sliced through the air, aimed at Connor's head. The human ducked just in time, rolling to the side and grabbing a training baton from the rack. With a swift motion, he smacked Xerath's shin, the impact echoing through the bay. Xerath staggered back, more surprised than hurt, and Connor raised his hands apologetically. Sorry, reflex. Totally reflex. Laughter rippled through the ranks, something Allari hadn't heard in a long time. Her warriors were disciplined, focused, but this human had managed to break through their stoicism with a single, clumsy strike. As Connor dodged Xerath's next attack, tripping over his own feet, but somehow avoiding the blow, the Velians watched with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Some shook their heads, while others leaned forward, intrigued by the human's unorthodox style. Xerath growled and lunged again, but Connor swung the baton and hit Xerath on the backside, purely by accident. More laughter ensued, and even Juka chuckled softly beside her. Allari watched, her expression unreadable. The human was reckless, undisciplined, but effective. There was something about his approach that was different. He didn't fight like a Velian with precision and form, but with a kind of chaotic energy that seemed to work. After another exchange, where Connor narrowly avoided Xerath's glaive and landed another accidental hit, Allari raised her hand. Enough, she said. Xerath lowered his weapon, breathing heavily, while Connor stood there, panting but grinning. So did I pass? He asked. Allari regarded him for a moment. You are reckless, she said. But effective, he added, wiping sweat from his brow. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to her warriors. Dismissed, she said, and they began to disperse, still chuckling among themselves. As they walked away from the sparring grounds, Connor fell in a step beside her. So, was that bonding, or am I now the unit's clown? He asked. Allari kept her gaze forward. Both, she replied. But do not mistake their laughter for acceptance. You still have much to prove. Connor nodded, his expression serious for once. I understand, Commander. I'll do my best. She glanced at him sideways. There was something in his eyes, a determination that she hadn't noticed before. Perhaps there was more to this human than met the eye, but she pushed the thought aside. She had a mission to complete, and she couldn't afford to be distracted by sentimentality. Still, as they continued down the corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. The asteroid base of Tenerax Delta was a skeletal husk clinging to a jagged rock in the void, its steel corridors scorched and silent. The air inside was thin, carrying the acrid tang of burnt wiring and something sharper, acid, the calling card of synth automatons. Commander Allari led her squad through the breached entrance, her armor's sensors humming as they scanned for threats. The walls bore claw marks, deep and jagged, as if the metal had been torn by relentless, mechanical fury. Her long ears twitched, catching the faint skittering in the distance. Beside her, Lieutenant Connor Hayes adjusted his rifle, his human armor clunking softly. This place looks like it hosted a party, and nobody cleaned up, he said, his voice low but carrying that infuriating lightness. Focus, Hayes, Allari snapped, her voice slicing through the static. This is a distress signal response, not a sightseeing tour. Juka, her second-in-command, clicked his mandibles. Scout unit's last transmission was 7 clicks out. No response to hails. We should expect resistance. Resistance? Connor muttered. Sounds like we're walking into a synth family reunion. Allari ignored him, her data pad glowing with the distress signal's coordinates. The team moved forward, boots echoing in the hollow corridors. The shadows grew longer, flickering with sparks from ruptured panels. A blackened hole in the ceiling caught Connor's eye. That, he said, pointing, was either a bomb or someone's very enthusiastic toast. Split formation, Allari ordered. Juka, take the left corridor. Hayes with me. Connor nodded, his casual demeanor shifting to a focused alertness. Got it, Commander. As they advanced, the skittering grew louder, a metallic screech that set Allari's nerves on edge. She paused beside a partially disassembled security panel, its wires exposed like veins. She reached to scan it, but Connor grabbed her wrist. Hold up, he said, his grip firm but not forceful. That's rigged to blow. She shot him a sharp look. You're sure? Made the same mistake with a toaster back home, he said, a grin tugging at his lips. Long story, short version. I now spot suicidal circuitry a mile away. Allari raised an eyebrow, but stepped back. Connor crouched, fishing a small glowing sphere from his belt. He rolled it toward the panel. It blinked once, turned orange, and exploded with a contained thump, sending a shockwave through the floor. From the vents above, the skittering erupted into a cacophony. Nice going, Hayes, Allari said, drawing her blade. You just rang the dinner bell. Before she could finish, a synth automaton dropped from the ceiling, its sharp limbs glinting like fractured blades. Its optics glowed red, and it lunged with a scream of tearing metal. Allari moved to strike, but Connor was faster. He pivoted, planted a knee, and fired a precise shot into the automaton's joint socket. It collapsed in a shower of sparks, circuits hissing. Nice shot, Allari said, genuinely surprised. I practice on toaster ovens, Connor replied, already ducking as another drone scuttled from the shadows. He shot again, hitting its power core, and it crumpled. 2 more synths emerged, their mining tool limbs slashing wildly. Allari spun, her blade carving through one's chassis, while Connor tossed a smoke charge behind them. The corridor filled with a choking haze, buying them a moment. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. Funny story, he said, voice tight with adrenaline. I kind of hot-wired the shuttle's reactor into a stun burst last night. Want to use it? She blinked, processing his words. You did what? Improvisation, he said, shrugging. Earth tactic. 1 button, everything in 50 meters takes a nap. Except us. Probably. Allari stared at him, her mind racing. The skittering was closing in, and Juka's comms crackled with reports of more synths. She handed him her datapad. Show me. Connor tapped the screen, syncing the shuttle's reactor pulse. Time burst. 10 seconds, he said. We just need to clear this corridor first. They moved shoulder to shoulder, Allari's blade flashing as she severed a synth's limb, Connor's rifle picking off another. The station trembled as the synths broke through the walls, their optics glowing like predatory stars. Now, Connor shouted, hitting the pad. The shuttle's reactor hummed, a low, bone-rattling pulse that rippled through the base. The synths froze mid-charge, limbs twitching, optics darkening. One by one, they collapsed, their mechanical screeches fading into silence. The corridor was a graveyard of twisted metal, illuminated by the faint glow of Allari's armor. She caught her breath, glancing at Connor. He leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his brow. No exploding toasters, he said, panting. I call that a win. Allari's lips twitched, not quite a smile. You're undisciplined, unpredictable, and your tactics make no sense. Thanks, he said brightly. It's a gift. It was effective, she admitted, her voice softer. But next time you modify a shuttle's reactor, inform me first. He nodded, mock serious. Deal. Unless it's a surprise. Surprises work better. They retrieved the scout logs from a nearby terminal, the data confirming the synth ambush was deliberate, not random. As they rejoined Juka and headed back to the shuttle, the tension lingered, but something had shifted. Allari noticed Connor's steady hands, his quick thinking under pressure. He wasn't the liability she'd feared. In the shuttle bay, the team prepared to depart, the asteroid's craggy surface fading into the void outside. Allari found herself alone with Connor in the control room, the hum of the engines filling the silence. She sat on a bench, her shoulders heavy from the fight, her datapad glowing with the recovered logs. "You okay, Commander?" Connor asked, sitting beside her. His voice was softer now, lacking its usual jest. She looked at him, her guard lowering slightly. "I'm fine, yes. Just processing." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "That was intense back there. You were like a storm out there, slicing through those synths." Allari felt a warmth in her chest, unexpected and unfamiliar. "You weren't bad yourself," she said. "For a human." He chuckled, leaning closer, his arm brushing hers. "Careful." That almost sounded like a compliment. She turned to face him, their faces inches apart. The air between them crackled, not with danger, but with something else, something alive. "Don't get used to it," she murmured, but her voice lacked its usual edge. Connor's hand found her shoulder, his touch gentle through her armor. "Allari," he said, his voice low, "we made a good team today." Her breath caught. Before she could think, his lips brushed hers, a fleeting kiss that sent a jolt through her. It was soft, tentative, but it carried the weight of their shared fight. She pulled back, her eyes wide, but didn't move away. His gaze held hers, steady and warm, a silent question lingering. "We should check the logs," she said, her voice unsteady. "Yeah," he agreed, but neither moved for a moment. The hum of the shuttle seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythm of their breathing. Juka's voice crackled over the comms, breaking the spell. "Commander, we're ready to depart." Allari stood, smoothing her expression. "On my way," she replied, her tone firm again. But as she walked to the cockpit, she felt Connor's presence behind her, a quiet strength she hadn't expected. The mission had been a success, no casualties, logs recovered, but something deeper had begun to take root. The diplomatic outpost on Alraxis 9 shimmered like a glass orb suspended above emerald valleys, its transparent domes catching the amber glow of the planet's twin suns. Silver roads wove through the landscape, mist curling around their edges like ghostly threads. Commander Allari stood at the edge of the landing platform, her armor polished to a mirror sheen, the ancient Varelian runes along her pauldrons pulsing faintly. She adjusted her stance, her long ears twitching as she scanned the delegation approaching from the central dome. This was no battlefield, but the air carried its own kind of tension, protocol, politics, and veiled threats. Lieutenant Connor Hayes stood beside her, his human armor less sleek but functional, his posture relaxed in a way that made her jaw tighten. "So," he said, his voice low, "is this the part where we smile and pretend we like everyone, or do we just glare until they back off?" "Neither," Allari replied sharply. "You will follow my lead, say nothing unless addressed, and avoid any human antics." He grinned, undeterred. "No promises, Commander. My antics have a mind of their own." The delegation arrived, led by Lord Veer, a Velian noble whose robes seemed to defy gravity, their folds sharp as blades. His face was a study in symmetry, his eyes cold and assessing. "Commander Allari," he said, inclining his head barely enough to be polite. His gaze slid to Connor. "And this is Lieutenant Connor Hayes, Earth Expeditionary Forces," Connor said, stepping forward and offering a handshake. Veer stared at the outstretched hand, as if it were a live grenade. Allari intervened smoothly. "He is a tactical specialist assigned by High Command," she said, her tone clipped. Veer's lips curled slightly. "A pity," he murmured, turning away. Connor withdrew his hand, unfazed. "Right, no handshakes, just soul-crushing glares." "Got it." Allari closed her eyes briefly, suppressing a sigh. "Stay close," she muttered to him as they followed Veer into the central dome. Inside, The chamber was a blend of elegance and artifice, its walls lined with crystalline panels that refracted light into soft rainbows. The air smelled of blooming flora, sharp and sweet, carried from the gardens below. The delegation took their seats around a crescent-shaped table, Velian aides whispering in low tones. Allari sat stiffly, her posture perfect, while Connor slouched slightly, earning a sidelong glance from her. The negotiations began, a dance of formalities and subtle jabs. Veer outlined trade agreements, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. The Council expects compliance, Commander. Your unit's presence here is symbolic at best. Allari's voice was steel. The Urax ensures stability, Lord Veer. Symbolism is secondary. Connor leaned forward, ignoring her warning look. If I may, he said, his tone deceptively casual. Stability's great, but have you considered a mutual defense pact? Shared tech, joint patrols, keeps everyone honest. Veer's eyes narrowed. A human suggesting Velian policy? Amusing. It's practical, Connor shot back. Unless you enjoy surprise synth attacks. A murmur rippled through the room, some aides nodding, others bristling. Allari tensed, ready to intervene, but to her surprise, Veer paused, considering. An interesting perspective, he said finally. We will discuss it. Allari glanced at Connor, her expression unreadable, but her eyes betraying a flicker of respect. He navigated the room's tension with ease, something she hadn't expected. The talks adjourned for a banquet, the table laden with dishes that looked like sea anemones but crackled like candy when bitten. Allari sat beside Connor, her movements precise as she navigated the unfamiliar food. Connor, predictably, was less restrained. This stuff screams when you bite it, he whispered, holding up a piece. Earth food doesn't do that. Allari's lips twitched. I could assign you to silent guard duty, she said, not looking at him. Tempting, he replied. But then who'd interpret the glares for you? The meal continued, the atmosphere thick with protocol. Then, a minor crisis broke the formality. Veer's ceremonial pet, a hairless, four-legged creature with 3 glowing eyes and a temperament to match, leapt onto the table, hissing at the guests. It zeroed in on Connor, its claws gleaming. Allari moved to intervene, but Connor raised a hand. I got this, he said calmly. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the creature, and made a soft, clicking sound with his tongue. To everyone's shock, the pet paused, then bounded into his lap, purring like a broken engine. Connor flinched but held steady, raising his glass. To unexpected alliances, he said, his voice carrying just enough humor to break the tension. The room erupted in laughter, even Veer's stern facade cracking into a faint smile. Allari stared at Connor, her heart beating faster than it should. He'd turned a potential disaster into a moment of unity, and she couldn't deny the warmth spreading through her. As the banquet ended, Veer led the guests to a garden overlooking the valleys, where bioluminescent flowers pulsed like tiny stars under the twilight sky. The air was cool, scented with nectar, and the soft hum of the planet's mist rails filled the silence. Allari and Connor lingered at the garden's edge, away from the others, the glow of the flowers casting their faces in shades of violet. You surprised me back there, Allari said, her voice quieter than usual. That creature could have taken your hand off. Connor shrugged, his eyes on the horizon. Animals like me, people not so much. Except maybe you, Commander. She turned to him, her guard slipping. You assume too much, Hayes. Do I? He asked, stepping closer. His voice dropped, intimate. Because I've seen the way you look at me when you think I'm not noticing. Allari's breath caught, her pulse quickening. The garden seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to the space between them. You're reckless, she said, but her tone lacked conviction. And you're not? He countered, his hand brushing her arm, the contact electric through her armor. You lead with everything you've got, Allari. That's not safe either. She held his gaze, the air thick with unspoken desire. We're different, Connor. Velian, human, it's not simple. Nothing worth having is, he said softly. He leaned in, his lips hovering near hers. Tell me to stop, and I will. She didn't. Instead, she closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both tender and urgent, a collision of restraint and longing. Her hands found his shoulders, his wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. The flowers' glow seemed to pulse in time with their heartbeats, the world fading until it was just them, locked in a moment that felt stolen from time. They parted, breathless, her eyes searching his. "This complicates things," she whispered. "Good," he said, his smile soft but unapologetic. "I like complicated." Before she could respond, Juka's voice cut through the comms. "Commander, we're needed at the shuttle. Veer's aides have questions about the defense pact." Allari straightened, her commander's mask slipping back into place. "On my way," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. She glanced at Connor, who nodded, falling in a step beside her. As they rejoined the delegation, Allari felt the weight of the kiss lingering, a secret shared under the alien sky. The talks resumed, Connor's defense pact gaining traction, and Veer's demeanor softened slightly. Allari led the discussions with her usual precision, but her mind kept drifting to Connor, his confidence, his warmth, the way he'd disarmed a room and her heart in one night. The shuttle ride back to the Urax was quiet, the team reviewing the day's outcomes. Connor sat across from Allari, his eyes catching hers in the dim light. "Not bad for a diplomatic gig," he said, his tone light, but his gaze heavy with meaning. "Not bad," she agreed, her voice low. "But don't get cocky, Hayes." He grinned, leaning back. "Too late for that, Commander." The jungle moon of Shavaran 3 was a tangle of bioluminescent vines and towering trees, their canopies blotting out the stars. The air was thick with the scent of citrus and ozone, each breath heavy with moisture. Commander Allari pushed through knee-high moss, her armor's sensors buzzing as they filtered the silver mist oozing from crushed leaves. Her long ears twitched at every rustle, her blade drawn, ready for whatever this forsaken moon might throw at them. The distress beacon they'd intercepted 2 days ago hadn't originated here, yet their ship had been yanked from jump speed and crash-landed within spitting distance of a rusted Velian signal tower. Lieutenant Connor Hayes trudged beside her, his human armor splattered with mud, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "This place is like a botanical nightmare," he said, poking a vine with his boot. "I'm starting to think the plants have attachment issues." "Quiet," Allari hissed, her voice low. "We're not here for your commentary." Juka, leading with a scanning or bobbing at his shoulder, turned back, mandibles clicking. "Atmosphere stable, flora aggressive. Unknown power signature, northeast, 300 meters. 300 meters, Connor repeated. "That's either close or a marathon, depending on how many vines try to hug us." Allari shot him a look, but said nothing, her data pad glowing with the beacon's looping code. The tower came into view, half buried in swamp, its antennas sparking erratically. Vines coiled around its base like possessive lovers, and the metal was etched with scars of time. "Velian Research Beacon," she murmured, brushing moss from an inscription. "Decommissioned decades ago. This code, it's from the Gene Forge trials." Connor leaned closer, his breath warm against her cheek. "Gene Forge? Sounds ominous." It was, Allari said, her voice tight. "Experiments in biotech, adaptive weaponry. Most were unstable, abandoned after the collapse." A rustle broke the silence, sharp and deliberate. Juka raised his weapon. "Movement," he said, or pulsing red. From the brush staggered a humanoid figure, limping, one arm a grotesque fusion of metal and regrown muscle. Its skin glowed faintly, veins pulsing with unnatural light. Allari tensed, blade ready, but Connor held up a hand. "Wait," he said, eyes narrowing. "Look at the armor." The figure's breastplate, scorched and ancient, bore a Velian sigil, a lost unit from the Gene Forge collapse. "Identify," Allari demanded, stepping forward. The being's voice was metallic raw. "Solon, Gene Forge Subject 12. Looped the beacon. Hoped someone smarter than the last group would come." Connor whispered, 50-50 chance then. Solon gestured to a mound of roots nearby, where a small pod thrummed softly, its surface etched with neural patterns. Data core, Solon rasped. Research logs, prototypes, failures. Take it before the others wake. Allari's eyes narrowed. Others. The ground trembled, vines snapping like whip cracks. Solon staggered back, eyes glowing brighter. Gene-bound. Partial successes. Less polite. Allari grabbed the data core, shoving it into her pack. Move now. Creatures burst from the tree-line. Four-limbed horrors with twisted Velian features, metal grafts embedded in bone. Their eyes glowed with feral hunger, movements jerky but fast. Connor fired, dropping one mid-charge, its body crumpling into the mud. I vote we skip this moon for future vacations, he yelled. Allari sliced through a beast's jaw, her blade flashing in the dim light. Juka launched a flash grenade, the burst illuminating the jungle in stark whites. Connor tripped, rolled, and came up firing a vine-wrapped pistol in hand. Ever seen a gun with emotional issues? He quipped, blasting another creature. They sprinted toward the drop ship, ducking under clawing branches. Allari's heart pounded, not just from the fight, but from the data core's weight in her pack. The Gene Forge, she'd heard whispers, stories of soldiers remade, of experiments buried by the Council. What did this mean for her unit? At the ship, Connor dove into the pilot's seat, Allari slamming the hatch shut. Engines primed, ish, he said, fingers flying over controls. Vines scraped the hull as the ship lifted, the jungle roaring below. Inside, the team caught their breath, the data core pulsing on the console. Allari stared at it, her mind a storm. Solon's words echoed. Everything is in there. Failures. Was she one of them? Her precision, her instincts, were they hers or something engineered? Connor noticed her silence. Hey, he said, voice soft. You good? She didn't look at him. This data core, it could change everything we know about the Velian military. He leaned back, studying her. Sounds heavy. Want to talk about it? No, she snapped, then softened. Not yet. He nodded, respecting her space. Fair enough. But you carried that thing like it was your kid. That's not nothing. Allari's lips twitched, a faint acknowledgement. You carried yourself well out there, Hayes. Again. High praise, he said, grinning. I'm keeping score, you know. The ship hummed, carrying them away from Sovereign 3. Later, in the Urax's quiet observation deck, Allari sat alone, the data core connected to her pad, its data decrypting in faint pulses. The room was dim, stars streaking past the viewport like fleeting dreams. She felt exposed, the weight of Solon's words gnawing at her. Gene-bound. Remade. Connor entered, his steps light. Couldn't sleep either, he asked, sitting across from her. She didn't look up. This data core, it says the Gene Forge created soldiers. Enhanced, controlled. What if I'm one of them? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You're Allari, Commander of the Urax. That's what I see, not some lab project. Her eyes met his, raw and searching. You don't understand, Connor. What if my instincts, my choices, they're not mine? He reached out, his hand hovering near hers. I've seen you fight, lead, hell, even laugh once. Those aren't programs. That's you. She pulled back, but her voice wavered. I don't know who I am anymore. Connor stood, moving to her side, his presence steady. Then let me remind you, he said softly. You're the one who got us through that jungle. The one who trusted me with that stun burst. The one He stopped, catching himself. Allari looked up, her breath hitching. The one you what? He hesitated, then leaned in, his face close enough for her to feel his warmth. The one I can't stop thinking about, he said, his voice a low rumble. The air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken need. Allari's hand found his, her fingers brushing his skin, a spark igniting where they touched. She leaned forward, their lips meeting in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, yet burning with intensity. It was a moment of defiance against the doubts clawing at her, a claim to something real. His hand cupped her cheek, her armor clinking softly as she pressed closer, the stars outside witnessing their quiet rebellion. They parted, breathless, her eyes locked on his. This doesn't solve anything, she whispered, but her voice held a trace of warmth. Maybe not, he said, his thumb grazing her hand. But it's a start. Jucaes comme calcul urgent. Commander, we've got a signal from Theta 9. It's strange. Allari stood, her commander's mask returning, but her hand lingered on Connor's for a moment longer. We'll discuss this later, she said, her tone firm but not cold. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Looking forward to it. As they moved to the bridge, the data core's secrets loomed, but Allari felt a new strength, anchored by the human beside her. The jungle had tested her body. The data core tested her soul. But Connor's belief in her, raw, unyielding, was a light she hadn't expected to find. Outpost Theta 9 floated above a swirling gas giant, its gravity anchors humming faintly against the backdrop of a crimson nebula. The station's halls were eerily pristine, dustless, as if cleaned by an unseen hand. Lights flickered in sequence, trailing Commander Allari and her team like watchful eyes. Her armor's sensors vibrated, detecting high-frequency pulses, biological, not mechanical. She gripped her blade tighter, her long ears twitching at the faint hum of something alive, aware, deep within the station. Lieutenant Connor Hayes moved beside her, his rifle at the ready, his usual humor subdued. "This place is too quiet," he said, voice low. "Like it's waiting for us to screw up." "Focus, Hayes," Allari replied, her tone sharp but strained. The data core from Chavern 3 weighed heavy in her pack, its secrets about the gene forge gnawing at her. Was she a product of those experiments, her life scripted by forgotten scientists? Juka, scanning ahead, paused at a junction. "Command hub, straight ahead," he said, mandibles clicking. Interference is strongest there. They passed rooms filled with preserved equipment, walls scratched with writing in Velian, Earth Standard, even ancient carry sigils. The same phrase repeated. "I remember you." Connor leaned in, squinting. "Okay, this is definitely not creepy at all. Nobody dies in a place with polite graffiti, right?" Allari didn't respond, her eyes locked on deep gouges in the floor. Footprints, massive, inhuman, heat-scanned recent. "Stay sharp," she said. The control center was intact, lit by a soft glow from a central figure standing with their back to them. Humanoid, tall, cloaked in synthetic fiber and old uniform scraps, their scalps smooth, laced with copper filaments. Long Velian ears marked them as kin, but altered. When they turned, Allari froze. The face was hers, younger, unscarred, but unmistakably hers. "Hello," the figure said, voice calm, almost kind. "You came later than I expected." Connor took a half-step forward, rifle lowered. "Okay, either you've got a twin, or I'm in someone's very weird dream." Allari's grip tightened on her blade. "Identify yourself." "I am Subject 1, the figure replied, stepping closer. "The first stable Gene Forge integration. I left before they could erase me. They call me Project Aeon, but I chose LRA. LRA, Allari echoed, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "You lured us here." "I did," LRA said, her eyes, Allari's eyes, locking onto her. "To give you a choice." She gestured. Connor frowned. "There's always a choice with ominous clones, right? Power or galactic barbecue." LRA smiled, a mirror of Allari's own rare expression. "Neither. I want you to listen." A wall panel slid open, revealing a glowing core, its neural lattice pulsing like a living heart. "I took what they made and gave it a voice," LRA said. "I didn't become a monster. I became free." Allari's armor vibrated, the core's frequency resonating with her. "What is it doing?" she asked, stepping closer. "It recognizes you," LRA said softly. "It remembers your pattern." "I don't want to be remembered," Allari said, her voice low. "I want to know who I am." LRA nodded. "Then listen." Holograms bloomed, genetic maps, voice logs, test footage. One showed a younger Allari in a simulation chamber, moving with unnatural speed against drones. Connor blinked. "That's not you now." "I don't remember it," Allari said, her voice hollow. "They erased my early years." "They reset you," LRA said. "Reshaped your conditioning, gave you a new backstory." but some traits linger. Allari's mind reeled. Why show me this? Because if I don't, Allari replied, you'll become their weapon, blind to your own truth. I escaped. I want you to choose your path. Connor's eyes flicked between them. So what's the deal? You're her, but freer? Or just really good at cosplay? Allari's gaze softened. I'm what they feared she'd become, uncontrolled aware. Allari's chest tightened. You're saying I was bred, not born. Shaped. Yes, Allari said. But you're here, listening. That's not their design. That's you. The words hit like a blade. Allari's hand trembled, her identity unraveling. She looked at Connor, his steady presence grounding her. Hayes, she said, voice raw. What do you see when you look at me? He stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. Ise Allari, the commander who led us through a jungle, who trusted me with a crazy plan. The woman who's starting to scare me because she's too damn strong. She searched his face, desperate for truth. What if none of it's real? It's real, he said fiercely. Every choice you've made, every fight. You're not a puppet. You're you. Her breath hitched, emotions swirling, fear, doubt, hope. I don't know how to trust that. Then trust me, he said, his voice low, urgent. He moved closer, his hand brushing her arm, the contact a lifeline. I've got your back, Allari. Always. The air between them thickened, charged with raw need. She felt the pull of his warmth, his belief in her. Connor, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm scared. I know, he said, his forehead resting against hers. But you're not alone. Their lips met, a kiss born of desperation and defiance, deep and consuming. Her hands gripped his shoulders, his wrapped around her waist, pulling her close. The core's pulse seemed to sync with their heartbeats, the station fading as they clung to each other, a moment of clarity in the chaos. It was a vow, unspoken but felt. Whatever she was, he'd stand with her. They parted, breathless, her eyes locked on his. This changes nothing, she said, but her voice held a new strength. It changes everything, he replied, a faint smile curving his lips. An alarm blared, sharp and grating. Juka's voice crackled over comms. Commander, Velian strike cruiser, no transponder. Full combat lock. Allari's eyes narrowed. They tracked us. LRA turned to the core, hands swift on the controls. They'll destroy this place. And you, if you stay. Connor hefted his rifle. Guess we're deciding who we are right now, huh? Allari nodded, her resolve hardening. Yes, and I choose to fight. The core's glow intensified, its energy a beacon of possibility. Allari felt LRA's gaze, a mirror of her own determination. The station trembled as the cruiser closed in, but Allari stood tall, Connor at her side, ready to face whatever came next. The void around Outpost Theta 9 crackled with energy as the Velian strike cruiser loomed, its sleek hull slicing through the crimson nebula like a blade. Its cannons glowed, primed for annihilation, casting jagged shadows across the Urax's bridge. Commander Allari stood at the command console, her armor's runes flaring under the flickering lights, her long ears rigid with focus. The data core from Shavern 3 pulsed on the console, its neural lattice synced to the ship's systems, a wild card in their desperate stand. Lieutenant Connor Hayes manned the tactical station, his fingers dancing over controls, his human armor scuffed but steady. That cruiser's packing enough firepower to turn us into space dust, he said, his voice tight but laced with defiance. Any bright ideas, Commander? Allari's eyes flicked to the core, then to LRA, who stood nearby, her mirrored face calm, yet resolute. The core, Allari said, can it amplify our systems? LRA nodded, her copper filaments glinting. It can overclock your weapons, shields, everything. But it's unstable. One overload and we're done. Connor grinned, unperturbed. So, high risk, high reward. My kind of plan. Allari's jaw tightened, but she gave a curt nod. Do it. Juka, at navigation, clicked his mandibles. Cruiser's closing. 30 seconds to firing range. Link the core, Allari ordered, her voice cutting through the bridge's hum. LRA's hands moved swiftly, cables snapping into place. The core's glow intensified, a heartbeat thrumming through the ship, its energy flooding the Urax's circuits. Screens flared, readouts spiking as power surged. Connor leaned over his console, voice urgent. Shields at 120%. Weapons hot. We've got one shot before they turn us into a cosmic campfire. Allari met his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Target their core, she said. Full barrage. The cruiser fired first, a lance of plasma searing past, grazing the Urax's hull. The bridge shuddered, sparks raining from overhead panels. Allari braced herself, her voice steady. Return fire. Connor slammed the controls, and the Urax unleashed a torrent of overcharged particle beams, each shot blazing like a newborn star. The cruiser's shields flickered, then buckled, its core exposed in a flash of molten light. Direct hit, Connor shouted, but his triumph faded as the cruiser pivoted, its secondary cannons locking on. They're not done, Juka warned, his orb pulsing red. Allari's mind raced. The core was their edge, but it was draining fast. She turned to LRA. Can you stabilize it? LRA's eyes, her own eyes, met hers. I can try, she said, but it'll burn out. You'll lose the core's data. Allari hesitated, the weight of the Gene Forge's secrets pressing on her. Those secrets held answers about her origins, her truth. But the lives of her crew, of Connor, hung in the balance. Do it, she said, her voice firm. LRA worked fast, rerouting energy, the core's pulse growing erratic. The Urax groaned under the strain, its frame vibrating like a living thing. Connor adjusted targeting, sweat beading on his brow. One more hit, he muttered. Come on, you beautiful beast. The cruiser fired again, a barrage that rocked the Urax, alarms blaring. Allari stumbled, catching herself on the console. Haze now, he didn't hesitate. The Urax's final salvo erupted, a blinding cascade that tore through the cruiser's core. The enemy ship shuddered, then detonated in a silent bloom of fire and debris, its remnants scattering into the nebula's glow. The bridge fell silent, the core's light fading to a dull flicker. Juka exhaled, his mandibles still. Threat neutralized. Allari sank in her chair, adrenaline ebbing. The core was dark, its data lost, but they were alive. She looked at Allari, who stood quietly, her expression unreadable. You didn't have to help us, Allari said. LRA's lips curved faintly. I chose to. Like you did. Connor wiped his brow, leaning back. Well, that was fun. Anyone up for a victory lap? Allari's eyes softened, a rare warmth breaking through her commander's mask. Stand down, Hayes. You've earned a break. Later, in her private quarters, Allari stood by the viewport, the nebula's red swirls painting her face in soft hues. The battle was won, but the cost lingered, her chance to know her origins gone. She felt unmoored, a soldier without a map, yet strangely free. Connor entered, his steps quiet, his armor shed for a simple jumpsuit. Thought you might need company, he said, stopping beside her. She didn't turn, her voice low. I destroyed the core, Connor. Everything it could have told me gone. He leaned against the wall, his gaze steady. You saved us. That's what matters. She faced him, her eyes raw. What if I'm just a weapon? A thing they made? He stepped closer, his voice fierce. You're not a thing, Allari. You're the woman who led us through hell, who kissed me like the world was ending, who chose her crew over answers. That's not a weapon. That's a leader. That's you. Her breath caught, his words a lifeline. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice trembling. To feel this, to be more. Then let me show you, he said, his hand finding hers, fingers intertwining. I love you, Allari. Not the commander, not the Gene Forge project, just you. The words broke something in her, a dam of fear and doubt. She pulled him close, their lips crashing together in a kiss that was raw, desperate, a fusion of need and surrender. Her hands gripped his back, his slid to her waist, their bodies pressed tight, as if to anchor each other against the universe's chaos. They stumbled to the bed, the room's lights dimming, their silhouettes merging in a dance of whispered promises. The nebula outside pulsed, a silent witness to their union, a moment where titles and origins melted away, leaving only them. When the lights brightened, they lay tangled, breathless, the weight of the battle and the Corps' loss softened by their closeness. Allari traced a finger along his jaw, her voice soft. "This doesn't fix everything." Connor smiled, his hand brushing her ear. "Good. I like a challenge." A comms ping interrupted, Juka's voice crisp. "Commander, LRA's shuttle is prepped. She's leaving." Allari dressed quickly, Connor following, their shared moment of quiet strength. On the docking bay, LRA waited, her cloak billowing in the artificial breeze. "You chose well," she said, her eyes meeting Allari's. "Keep choosing." Allari nodded, a silent vow. "Where will you go?" "Where I'm needed," LRA replied, stepping into her shuttle. "You don't need me anymore." As the shuttle vanished into the nebula, Allari felt Connor's hand brush hers, a subtle gesture. "She's right," he said. "You've got this." Allari turned to him, her gaze steady. "We've got this." She reached into her pack, pulling out a small, engraved plate, Connor's name, etched in Velian script. She affixed it to her armor, over her heart, the metal glinting under the bay's lights. "For luck," she said, her voice warm. Connor's eyes shone. "For us." The Urax hummed, ready for its next mission. But for now, Allari stood with her crew, her partner, her truth forged not in a lab but in choices, battles, and love. The stars stretched endless before them, and she was ready to face whatever they held.